In this session, we're going to talk about routes to recovery and look at investment prospects for a renewed market. Now, of course, things are still extremely difficult. Recovery hasn't really started yet, at least not outside of Asia. But there will be an eventual rebound. We don't know exactly when, we don't know exactly what it'll look like, but it will come. So in this session, we'd like to know where renewed growth will come from in terms of segments as well as geographies, and where the hot investment opportunities are likely to be when the renewed growth comes. And we might consider a few case studies of successful crisis management and recovery from previous downturns. And we'll talk about how public entities like tourism boards and investment authorities can best assist the recovery and create resilience against future shocks. I'm delighted with the panel we've assembled today. You'll hear some important voices from North America as well as the Caribbean, and also an Asia perspective as well. I'd like to ask our panelists if you could please introduce yourselves very briefly to everyone, and then I'm really eager to start to ask you some questions. Perhaps let's start first with Mr. Silverman.
Hi, my name is Dan Silverman. I am the Vice President of Foreign Direct Investment at Investissement Quebec International. We are the provincial-wide economic development organization, as well as a financing corporation to both local and foreign businesses.
Thank you. Mr. Bursey?
Yes, good afternoon, everybody. And my name is James Bursey. Our organization is called Turks and Caicos, and we are the tiny little islands right at the south of the Bahamas. Sometimes refer to ourselves as the last rocks on the left.
Excellent. And Mr. Volek?
Yeah, good evening from Asia. I suppose it's good morning on that side. My name's Dominic Volek. I'm the Group Head of Sales for Henley Partners. So we're a specialist investment migration firm assisting private clients as well as governments around the world with the various residence and citizenship by investment programs.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And if it's okay, I'll probably switch to your first names just to make it a little bit easier. Just in terms of a couple quick housekeeping points for our audience, we hope you'll be able to ask some Q&As a bit later. So please be thinking what you would like to ask. And I've asked the speakers that we'll be a little bit fluid and dynamic here in order to give you quite an engaging, chatty panel. So we'll proceed on that basis. This is a PowerPoint-free zone since it's your last session of the day. And I really want to start off and ask Daniel and James about the prospects for the recovery in your particular geographies. I mean, in general, but also, of course, very specifically for the tourism market. What do you think that will look like, and in which segments do you expect to see the fastest and clearest turnaround? You know, that might be business travel, it might be leisure, it might be luxury, and so on. Let me ask Daniel first.
Sure, I guess some very good timing as the provincial government just announced a $400 million, I guess you can call it a $400 million grant to the tourism and culture industry here in the province of Quebec to get people to start traveling domestically as we come through COVID. I'm not sure how many people are very well aware we're at the epicenter of Canada, the province of Quebec, with Montreal having over 25,000 cases and the province of Quebec having over 50,000. But also what I've noticed in the past week is the federal government has jumped in as well on the tourism and culture side. And they've given, for instance, Tourism Toronto, which is my old stomping ground with Toronto Global, $8 million to increase tourist activities as well as culture. We always call it tourism and culture. But one of the big discussions here is, you know, Montreal is quite the vibrant place in the summertime, and we have the Formula One race. We have the second largest jazz festival in the world, one of the largest comedy festivals in the world, and all that has essentially been shut down. So what our government and what our partners have been looking at is how do we increase that, and the way we increase getting people to come into the city or just opportunities for these industries is to have domestic travel increase significantly. So part of what we're doing is we've reopened campgrounds. We're talking about reopening concert halls and cinemas and drive-in theaters. But how are we going to affect those local businesses and the restaurants that drive part of the economy that we have? So part of this $400 million is to go to that, is to show people, is to keep these hotels up and running. And Yes, Montreal has the big Marriotts and the W's and the Sheratons and whatnot, but we also have a lot of really boutique old hotels in the old port that are dependent on being there for people that are coming into Montreal and into Quebec. Same thing with the city of Quebec, which is one of the oldest cities in North America. They have a huge tourism component to their economy, and that has been hit hard too. So how do we get people from around the province and Ontario to start looking at traveling there? And that's what we're trying to do, is to promote that. On terms of FDI side of it, I mean, that it's been pretty quiet on an FDI perspective from tourism. As you may or may not have seen, that the Quebec government has stepped in to help keep the Cirque du Soleil up and running, which is essentially a Quebec-owned business, Quebec-based business. So we're trying to figure out these ways to do things to keep these businesses thriving that are dependent on visitors to our economy. And the Quebec government's taken a pretty aggressive approach to it, but it's going to start with ourselves and trying to do that. On the FDI side of things, some of the projects that we had for this summer have obviously stepped back a little bit. However, we do see that they're still looking forward at doing these investment projects, but it's going to have a certain delay that it follows.
And is domestic tourism enough to keep things afloat?
We believe it can be. I mean, with Toronto being just down the 401 highway, the fourth largest major metro area in North America, there is that opportunity to bring people in. Our problem being right now is that we are the epicenter still in Canada. Our cases have dropped to below 300 as of yesterday, new cases, but our deaths are in the 5,000 range. And that's something, and the city of Montreal is kind of the epicenter of it. So Quebec City isn't as hit as hard. We have a vibrant hunting, fishing, and camping ecosystem to the north of the cities. Also, Gaspésie, Ile de la Madeleine is a very attractive location. I think places like that will still be okay. Our other biggest, I guess, issue to some is the border is effectively closed to the United States until June 21st at a minimum. So that flow of American dollars coming into the Canadian market at a 30% increase for Americans really helps us. So I don't know if it'll be enough domestic travel because it's $1 for dollar, but when Americans come and spend, it's $1.30 for dollar. And it's advantageous for them, it's advantageous for us. But I think that as we start to come through COVID, and hopefully we have, we'll start to see that increase. I'm just not sure what's going to happen at the borders right now.
Thank you. And James, I suppose for Turks and Caicos Islands, domestic tourism, that's a little bit of a non-starter. You are relying quite heavily on international tourists, and I suppose in particular North American tourists. So what do you do now?
For most of us, domestic tourism is walk about 300 yards to the beach. So that really doesn't do much for your economy. So really, I mean, we're a little country with 42,000 people, half of whom are nationals, the other half are basically people living here and working here. So we are 80% of our GDP is tourism and tourism development dependent. So that isn't just the most important industry, it is the industry. We also cater to, in the western part of the country, we cater really to the luxury market. Our ADR is the highest in the Caribbean by a very long shot. So we're not a mass market. And then in the eastern part of the country, we have a cruise business. It is a cruise destination in Grand Turk. Now you put the two numbers together and we get almost 1.4 million visitors. About 1 million of those come for half a day on a cruise ship, and the other 400,000 come for an average of 10 days. So it's quite a wide range, quite a disparity. Our part of the market which really drives our economy, makes everything work well, is the luxury tourism, 5-star and above. We have Amanyara Resort here. We have mostly 5-star resorts. We have a couple of mass market organizations that have been here for a very, very long time. One, of course, is Club Med, and the other one is Beaches, part of Sandals. But beyond that, the rest of this is market which really caters to, we don't really see any discount carriers coming in here at all. And 50% of our landings are private jets. So it's skewed to the luxury end of the market. Um, we are caught between, of course, I think advantageously, so between two very prominent financial centers, which of course the Cayman Islands and BVI, and so we do get some spillover effect there. But fundamentally, we right now would like to see as many tourists as would like to come. They have a problem though. Our borders are closed until July 22nd. On March 24th, our governor and premier felt the situation was so nasty that we just shut the whole country down. So we went into both a complete lockdown internationally and 2 days later a complete quarantine, so that there was curfew from 8 p.m. to 5 a.m. And that is still in effect. That is loosening up now. And our internal economy will be operating in early July, so slow reopen. End of July, international economy comes back. So that's basically closing down an economy for 4 months. So as you can imagine, there's a certain amount of pain. Everybody's enjoying it. And we do want to start getting people coming in. Interestingly enough, though, on the foreign direct investment side, no projects have disappeared, no projects have slowed down. And so we have had a tremendous continuation. I might even hazard on a couple of areas, we're seeing an increase in FDI, even though we're locked down.
Well, that's quite a story. And why is that? I mean, are these FDI deals related to the tourism sector or other things? Are there things that were maybe already in the pipeline that you'll go ahead with?
There are projects that were in the pipeline. They are all tourism and real estate development. I mean, think about it. About 50% of the keys in this market are in private villas. And many of those private villas then, when the owners aren't there, are put onto the open rental market. And of course, managed to various management firms. So that's a very big part of our market. In addition to which, a lot of those owners of those villas decided that it would be a very good place to ride out whatever shutdowns are taking place. And so a lot of our villas are full here. Many of them have been occupied by their owners, and if not by their owners, friends or renters. So we have quite a few guests here, regardless. They rode riding this out because we're only halfway through our closure at this point. It's quite a pleasant place to ride out, but I think also long-term as an investment destination and also as a destination for wealthy to basically base the family businesses and the family offices out of is an attractive destination. So we're seeing that driving the economy.
I think it makes sense. Having visited TCI in the past, I can say that if I had a villa there, that's absolutely where I would be quarantining myself. I'd like to hear from Dominic. Of course, Asia went through this crisis a bit sooner and therefore has started coming back to life a bit sooner. What lessons do you think we can take from that?
It's still very much sort of within the pandemic. You know, Singapore only as of today has entered our phase 1 of reopening the economy, and that, like everywhere else in the world, is a very sort of measured, slow approach. I think our phase 1 is still relatively locked down. Everyone's still working from home. The airports are not, there's not so many tourists coming in. And that's at the moment expected to still last the whole of June, at which point we only enter phase 2. So I think Singapore, one of the lessons, I think Singapore was caught to a certain extent with the second wave, which then led to a stricter lockdown. And I think that's something we can see in Europe as a potential risk there as well. Hong Kong has certainly opened up a bit more, and China itself. But if you look at the sort of one of the bigger tourism markets here is Thailand. There, I think they had 39 million tourists in 2019, and I was reading the other day, it's the one country that has the biggest impact on workers in the tourism industry, and Thailand is still their international airport, I think, will open again only in July. So still a huge impact, still a long way to go. I would say, as I said, China, Hong Kong recovering maybe a bit quicker and opening up in terms of airports and that. Australia, New Zealand, of course, if we go sort of further south, they have fared very well in the pandemic, both in terms of their response and in terms of the numbers. So there is talk of these sort of first movers in terms of allowing international travel, and certainly all of my expat friends in Singapore are now looking at Australia, New Zealand as the next holiday destination or the first place they can get to once they can travel again.
Well, you can do worse than that for a holiday. Are there, and this is a question for any of you, I mean, this isn't the first, this is a pretty unique global crisis in the way that it's come about, but it's not the first crisis, and we saw tourism industry, travel and tourism get hit fairly badly in previous financial crises. I know the Caribbean market struggled quite a lot as a result of that. What lessons can we take from recovery of previous crises?
We have those neat little things called hurricanes that we have an annual season. So we roll the dice every year. So for us, disaster management, disaster planning is a way of life. And, some countries do better, some countries don't do as well, but I think we're pretty comfortable that we've learned a lot of lessons. 2017 was a huge wake-up call for PCI. We hadn't had a really bad hurricane for a long while. And then, of course, it came roaring through. Well, two of them came roaring through 3 weeks apart. That was a problem. But the other thing is the private sector here, which is very, very heavily, not only heavily involved in the economy, but also involved in the infrastructure of the country, was pretty well prepared to get back to work as quickly as possible. So one of the things that we had was a combined government and private sector effort. And I think the private and public sector work very well together here, especially in terms of both any emergency and then at the same time, once you've had an emergency or disaster, recovering quickly. We've had practice. That's the simplest way to put it.
I guess from an investment promotion standpoint, how active can you be in taking your message to market? And it's a question for you as well as for Daniel. I mean, I speak to a lot of investment promotion agencies around the world, and some believe you need to be out there with your message so people don't forget you, even though there aren't so many projects around, or you need to lay low and maybe focus more on helping out your existing investors. How do you get that balance right?
That's a crystal ball I don't have. But we do help out our existing investors. This past weekend, I talked to every one of our major hotel investors and developers here. That is a weekly, not just an exercise, it just happens. We are lucky we're a small enough country so we can do that easily. But that's an important part of what we do. Try to address their problems. Their problems, quite frankly, is on the one hand, protecting themselves and their staff from the ravages of COVID-19, and the second part, trying to mitigate the economic hit that they're taking by having closed borders. So it's a delicate balancing act. On the other hand, regarding inward investment, that has not stopped. And pretty well all the investors that we're looking at have sufficiently large projects that they take a multi-year view to the process. I don't think anybody, I think if people in the investment community felt that we would never get on top of COVID-19, I think throughout the world, the investment community would stop and go home. I think there's a certain level of optimism that eventually we will muddle through this and we'll come up with a solution. Therefore, for multi-year projects, we are not seeing any slowdown whatsoever. Matter of fact, I'm surprised that we've actually picked up a couple of projects during the shutdown, contrary to what I'm hearing in some other areas. So we're comfortable. Again, we're a niche destination. And I think that helps us too. We're at the luxury end of the market. We're at the high margin end of the market and the high capital cost end of the market too. So if that is part of your appetite, investors come to us.
Do you feel that the luxury segment will rebound a bit easier? Or how would you compare that to the kind of mass market tourism?
I've been making a lot of phone calls around the world to a number of developers and investors. Everybody's telling me the same thing. The luxury market is an easy one to invest in. It's a logical place to go. Those people who buy luxury product have the wherewithal, have the ability to distance themselves, have effectively a survival package around them, for lack of a better way to put it, survival envelope that is much higher than the average person, and therefore they feel more comfortable, more confident to spend. Hence, if you're in the luxury products business or the luxury locations business, you will have business probably faster than any other part of the economy.
Yeah, you're in probably the right niche for that. Yeah. And Daniel, looking at it from a Quebec perspective, how is your agency maybe reframing its investment promotion offer and even strategy?
Great question. Two things that we did do as soon as the the pandemic hit. The government came out with what's called a $2 billion loan program for small to mid-sized businesses. Actually, anybody. The minimum loan was $50,000. They came out with about 5 or 6 programs, but this was called PACT. And our entire staff of my division is about 60 people, but the entire staff of Investissement Quebec is 700. We put in place immediately kind of a call center to field requests from all industries, from more or less all industries, from Quebec-based businesses, but as well as foreign businesses that have operations here in Quebec, to how we can support them. And in a typical year, we field about 2,000 calls. In about 2 weeks, we fielded about 2,000 calls. So about how to support it. And what we've done on this side is, we've actually been very engaged with our tourism groups, both in Montreal and Quebec and other areas, because they're still looking to move forward on attracting events, both touristic events, festivals and whatnot, but also business tourism. And business tourism in Quebec and Montreal has always been a very huge industry. Because of the amount of conferences. We are a very international province. I don't know how many people have visited it, but Quebec City is a flavor of Europe, and so is the old port of Montreal. And so we've kind of turned a little bit and had to do a little bit more traditional FDI, and we're still seeing those projects coming in with the data centers and battery manufacturing, electric vehicle manufacturing is a huge component here in Quebec. But I think one also to a little bit to your point earlier, and in your question to James, Courtney, we're seeing the federal government, the provincial government, and the municipal governments having to band together during this process. And Canada had a little bit of I guess you could say the last crisis or pandemic of this nature was SARS, with seeing what happened in Toronto. And so Toronto immediately had a team to put in place. And in Montreal, we were able to, or Quebec, we were able to kind of remember what happened there. From the FDI side of things, we are still being aggressive yet sensitive to the fact of what's happening globally. We are seeing some reshoring opportunities coming about, and that's across all sectors. But I think part of what we're wanting to do is we're wanting to show existing businesses that we're here to support you, whether you're Quebec-based or whether you're foreign-based. And to those businesses that are looking here, we're trying to show them what we're doing for the businesses that are here. And whether there's wide criticism or not about the loan the Quebec government gave to the Cirque du Soleil, which was about $200 million, and I don't know the details of it, that's a Quebec business that is global. And, when you think of Cirque du Soleil, a lot of people who are close to it think of Quebec. And we're trying to show the world as well that we're supporting our businesses, but we're supporting businesses that are doing work around the globe. But at the end of the day, part of what we want to do is we want to increase the number of businesses coming to Quebec, but we also want to increase the number of people coming to Quebec. Now, borders closed, that changes things. I mean, we're in less of a need on the touristic side than perhaps James is, and I do know a lot of Quebecers that do go down to Turks and Caicos, and in this time they have been, or there's been a few that have decided not to come back, to your point earlier. But for us, we're still trying to walk before we run when it comes to how we do things. And our economy essentially started to open yesterday, officially reopened yesterday, with shopping starting to open again. And again, it's a tough thing to say, being that we're the epicenter in Canada. But we do see the need for this economy to open. And we know that the tourism industry for us is going to be something huge. And yes, we are both a winter and summer destination for tourism, but I think we get a lot more from the south coming up north in the summer than we do in the winter.
Absolutely. And Dominic, if we're thinking about investment, the obviously citizenship by investment initiatives are quite popular around the Caribbean, and I know that your group has worked to advise and facilitate those. Do you think that the crisis makes those more popular and appealing as a way to increase investment?
both more popular and appealing, but also more necessary. Daniel mentioned some of the grants and loan schemes being offered in Canada, but this is no different to all the countries around the world. There's a lot of job support schemes and various initiatives being rolled out by governments everywhere to support everyone during this very difficult period. Of course, the question is where does all that money come from? And typically, governments are having to turn to sovereign debt markets and to raise that type of money. We spend a lot of our time speaking to governments around what we refer to as sovereign equity. So through investment migration, whether it's citizenship or residence by investment, if you design these programs correctly, and of course you get the due diligence correct and all of that around it, you can raise significant foreign direct investment into countries. So, and this is typically seen on the back of these types of global events. So James mentioned the hurricanes that went through the Caribbean in 2016, 2017, and there now you have five of these islands that have citizenship by investment programs, and specifically they create hurricane relief funds that international foreigners can invest into or contribute quite significantly into these funds, anywhere from $100,000 to $200,000 in order to acquire citizenship, and then of course they get the various benefits from that. But investment migration is very much about a win-win scenario. So as much as you have wealthy people around the world that look to participate in these programs, the governments themselves can obviously benefit significant from these as well. We saw after the global financial crisis in Europe, the likes of Portugal and Greece all launched their own versions of a golden visa residence program, also to raise much needed foreign direct investment to help their economies. Malta is a classic example, very small Mediterranean island, just south of Italy, very reliant on tourism and some other industries. And for the first time in their history since introducing their citizenship by investment program, they now sit in a budget surplus position, and 90% of that is because of their citizenship by investment program. And we can really see some of the islands in the Caribbean responding to this. So just last month, St. Lucia, who has had quite a popular citizenship by investment program for the last few years, they've now launched as one of the investment options a COVID-19 relief bond. So individuals can invest into this bond at $250,000 to acquire citizenship. And of course, this is very popular, particularly here in Asia, where a lot of people are not as fortunate to be born in a country where their passport is very good from a travel freedom perspective. So, very popular in markets like China and Bangladesh and Philippines, where, these are very successful entrepreneurs, very talented, who look to get that travel freedom. And if they can do that by supporting governments and helping them to raise, as I said, sovereign equity as opposed to going to the debt markets, then it's extremely beneficial for them. And in a lot of the cases in Antigua, we've seen it as well. The money they raise actually can be used to actually paying off some of the debts that they've raised in previous years.
The idea of selling citizenship can be controversial, though, and there is occasional backlash against these initiatives. How would you kind of offset or counter any concerns or even public relations worries over it?
I think communication is the key, because I think most people, they as I said earlier, they only see the private client side or private client reasons for this. I think a lot of it comes down to the government communicating what benefits these programs are bringing. In the Caribbean, across the 5 islands, some of them as much as 30% of government revenue comes from the program. The point is, very few they refer to them as economic citizens, are moving to the islands. They're using it for travel freedom or as a plan B insurance policy for themselves. But certainly not enough is done to promote the benefits that the program is bringing to the government. I think the governments are getting better at it, but it's certainly an area that more can be done in terms of showing not only the economic, but also the societal value that these programs can bring to mostly these small island nations that are offering them.
Thank you very much. And James, I'd like to have your take on this. Is this something that Turks and Caicos Islands makes use of? Would you consider it? And how do you see the pros and cons of this model?
We are a British overseas territory, so we are very constrained by what Whitehall tells us to do in many respects. So while we have basically local autonomy for governance, when it comes to anything to do with our borders, that very heavily falls in Whitehall. England has, of course, as you know, a citizenship by investment program. We in the Turks and Caicos and none of the overseas territories do. What we do have is we have a residency by investment program. Residency by investment program is very, very expensive relative to the rest of the Caribbean, where quite frankly, there are more countries offering full citizenship at a fifth of what we offer residency. So our program was structured historically in such a way to attract people. It hasn't really done that, but there's something else that's happened. If you think of this country, in 1966, which I'm old enough to have been alive then, in 1966, this country had a population of 3,500 people. The Queen came here to give a speech as the population of one of the islands was literally packing with their bags on the wharf to move to Bahamas because the salt industry had collapsed and it was a major driving force. Today we have 42,000 people living here, and that is not by natural expansion. The local population is actually less than 20,000. But it is because a number of people came down here and invested. The island that I'm on, Providenciales, 1970 had 500 people, with 38,000. And this is because it's become the center of our small but very profitable tourism industry. And most of that investment came from Canada and the United States, some from the UK, certainly. But these were either individuals or groups of individuals who put up hotels, put up villa complexes, whatever. In the process, they wanted to stay. And so we've kind of developed a backhanded version of a citizenship by investment program where people stay. And that now is becoming more popular once people have made investments. We are getting more inquiries about people, though, coming to live permanently. This is a bit of a change. There are all kinds of changes going on worldwide. Certainly in the OECD countries, the rise of European taxation has been a big push. And so certain people have already made their funds thinking of maybe transiting that capital to the next generation. We're talking to them. And not only us, but many other Caribbean islands. So that is changing. We used to think that it was residence or citizenship as an escape hatch. We can mention certain portions of the world we know where that would be attractive. That's becoming less and less of an issue. And yes, we are talking to more people from Asia. We are talking to quite a few people from Europe in particular, and less so from North America. And again, that reflects political stability and where people perceive future to be.
Thank you. And I guess on the subject of Asia, thinking of China in particular, there's obviously been very large increases in recent years of Chinese tourists seeing more and more of the world. I know in European cities have benefited enormously from increasing numbers of Chinese tourists visiting and also trying to cater more to that market. Daniel, is this something you're seeing in Quebec and kind of reacting to? And I guess the difficulties in China that it's had throughout the crisis has obviously put a hold on that outbound tourism flow. But when it resumes, is this something that's part of your strategy?
So we have an office in China. We have two offices in China, actually, with the Quebec government. And ours just did their first FDI trip in many months within China. Which was quite exciting, but it is a huge influx, especially in the fall here, because a lot of the Chinese and Japanese tourists come by the planeful to come to the Laurentians, which is just the area north, to see how the leaves change color here in Quebec. And when I say it, I mean the bus industry and the tourism industry during the months of September till probably the end of October. It just, I remember when I used to work at the Montreal airport, it was plane after plane after plane after plane, including private jets from the very wealthy families that are coming from Asia. And I don't think it's really been a topic yet. We have seen the major airlines in Canada have kind of put a pause on all flights. There was a discussion that even amongst, regular flight patterns between the United States and Canada with Air Canada won't resume until maybe December. So I think that's going to be a secondary hurt to the system, to the ecosystem here in tourism. Discussions about whether we let people in or not. The border is essentially really only closed right now to the United States. And there are still flights going back and forth. They're not as full. They're not as frequent as they once were. The airports are pretty quiet. But I do think that in one way or another, the door can't be closed to Chinese tourism or Chinese investment. We are seeing still an influx of opportunities. We've been fortunate enough to still see a few projects from China come to fruition during this time, not necessarily tourism related, but we do see that they are a huge source of revenue to the economy here in Quebec, especially during that fall time. Where I think across Canada might be hit a little bit harder is on the West Coast, where there are much more frequent flights. There is a much larger Chinese community in Vancouver on the west side. So they have taken a little bit more of a hit than we have. I think ours will only come in that fall when it's really the key part of Asian countries coming in here is really during that changing of the seasons, I guess you could say.
So I guess the autumn will be a bit of a test as to how much, things are coming back.
I think so. For us, it definitely will be. It'll also be a test to see how open the federal government is to kind of reopening all the borders and resuming a lot of the flights. It's not just Quebec, it's Ontario as well, and to a certain extent Manitoba that have these northern and New Brunswick that have these northern communities. And I look out my window right now and I can tell you that in a few months there'll be several different colors than just the green on the trees that I see right now. So it will be a test in the autumn to see how that has changed. I would compare it in a very little bit to the cherry blossoms in Japan, with the amount of tourism that goes there from North America. We really see that coming here, except it's just regular trees here.
But beautiful regular trees.
Beautiful regular trees.
And James, to what extent is Chinese tourism and investment on your radar and making much of an impact where you are?
Well, investment is already here, maybe certainly in the sense of newer markets. They lead with investment. We have Chinese who have bought properties here. We have Chinese who are developing hotels here, and they're getting involved in infrastructure. So we're happy to have them. They are welcome, and we look forward to them sort of being good, solid corporate citizens. Chinese tourists have been relatively thin for the moment, but again, we'll wait until the hotels, etc., are up and running. And once those are, I expect we'll have a lot more Chinese tourists. Throughout the Caribbean, there are a lot of Chinese tourists already. They just haven't landed very heavily on our shores. But certainly the Bahamas, we take a look at Jamaica, we take a look at Dominica, they've had a tremendous influx of Chinese tourists on a regular basis. So yes, they're going to be here. We welcome them. And they have different sensibilities. So we will adjust. At the end of the day, we're a service economy. We're here to please as many people as possible.
Dominic, is there much of a relationship between travel and tourism and investment, in the sense of the more people from a certain country are able to travel and visit and attend conferences, they are more inclined to eventually invest there if they're in a position to do so?
I would say, Courtney, just from my perspective, I think yes, because I've seen it with many clients in the past, and I used to be in the private sector on the consulting side of things, and I saw it in Toronto, and I've seen it to a certain extent here in Quebec, that people don't know an ecosystem sometimes until they see it, and when they come in, they see the business opportunities, and that could be the same thing in Turks and Caicos as well, as people perceive a place like that to just be a vacation destination, and at the end of the day they come back and see about the potential that's in these markets. And I could probably easily on two hands name off companies that hadn't previously looked at markets, that had visited there and then told us that we thought about the opportunity that was in this market, and that's why we decided to make an investment here. But the only reason I saw it is because I vacationed with my family, or I went to a conference and I got exposure to it. So I think there is a connection, and that's where I think a lot of across the globe, a lot of cities across the globe are going to hurt because of all these events that have been canceled.
There's one thing that's very clear as far as our islands in the Caribbean go. If people come here, they then ask the question, what would it be like to, and then fill in the blank, have a home, have an apartment, be more permanently part of this? If they don't make that first step, it's very hard. And so when I go to New York and I go to London, etc., talking to people, I always tend to congregate around those people who've been to Turks and Caicos because they're half sold. And so the reality, and I think that's true of any destination, it's probably true in Quebec, it would be true pretty well anywhere. If you find a place that somehow tickles your interest, you'll want to be there more permanently.
I think there's certainly a logic there. I know in Canada that there is a Business Events Canada, and it is particularly geared towards attracting conferences, right, using that to therefore, promote FDI in these sectors. And I guess that is a challenge for FDI going forward with the fewer business events, fewer possibilities to meet people in certain markets. And that would be one of the, I suppose, potential drags on the FDI flows. If we start to look, I guess, towards the future, and predicting future is not really a game that you want to get in, but if we, but we'll do it anyway, just for fun. If we are having a panel exactly like this a year from now, and we're talking about tourism in the Caribbean and tourism in Canada, what do you think we'll be talking about? Where will we be?
I think for the great majority of the destinations in the Caribbean, I think it will be slow but steady recovery. I think it will be patchy, though. I think it will be uneven. The big question, certainly everything that I'm following and reading out of Europe, the Europeans are more travel-oriented at the moment, and in particular because of what is coming out of various leadership positions in the United States. There's more of an inward navel-gazing kind of approach. So I think the great majority of people are thinking of domestic vacations as opposed to international ones. For us in the Caribbean, we are very dependent on the United States market, although thankfully we've seen significant growth in the South American market, people coming in. Now, Europe is a big contributor to the Caribbean. For our little country, though, we are very dependent on Canada and the United States. Less than 3% of our tourists come from Europe in its entirety, including the UK, which is very, very small. So from our perspective, I think we will focus pretty heavily on our luxury segment, because that still seems to be the most mobile. But other parts of our tourism, I think they will see spotty recovery. And that will be no different than anywhere else in the Caribbean. That's my guess. The other part of it, though, is the FDI and the property sales, because those are very important parts of our economy. That I am surprised to see now showing no slowdown, either in the sale, as we keep in touch, obviously. As an investment agency, we keep in touch with the realtors very carefully. And they're steadily selling product. It's kind of funny. I was talking to a realtor the other day. He said, no, I've got a showing. I said, you can't have a showing, we're shut down. I said, no, you don't understand. I'm showing this to a client using my video camera walking around. And 24 hours later, he had an offer. So that's the way in which properties are moving. We're happy to see that. So I think if I'm looking from our perspective a year down the line, I think it won't be where we want it to be, but I think we will be thankful for the long-term FDI that we've had, and we'll have seen the top end of the market recover pretty quickly.
Thank you. And I suppose on the property front, I mean, if you are liquid at this moment, it is the time, it's a buyer's market at the moment to be eyeing opportunities for second homes or what have you.
I think there's a lot of people who are willing to, the old issue, I used to be in the private equity business, and the whole issue, I used to have two things I always used to do. I never see a deal once, I always see it 3 times, and I buy on the third. And the other part of it was, you first have to have a willing seller, because you can't buy anything without a willing seller. Well, I mean, some countries do different things, but realistically. So what we look at is, are there enough properties on the market? And what we're seeing is there's more of them. Now, are the prices down? In a lot of cases, no. But there is that indication that people want to move on, and there's an indication that people want to change. When people want change, we see real estate turnover. It's pretty active at the moment.
Daniel, from your perspective, if we ask you to come back a year from now and talk to us about what's going on in Quebec, what will you be telling us?
We might be doing this event from James's beach house in a year from now, but
Let's hope so.
no, I think a couple things. People have had such an itch to travel that I think there's going to be a little bit of a spike and then a little bit of a fear again once we do come out of this. I do think that probably going into this time of year, into the, I guess, call it spring for us with 4 seasons here in Quebec, there'll be a little bit of that hesitation going into the spring market of travel. I do think, as I can say right now, events are being planned, events are being looked at and coming back within the next 12 months. We've had some events that have been postponed, business events and tourism events, to come back, the boat shows, the auto shows, things that are driving people to go and get out are going to continue to do that. Interesting what you mentioned there on the housing side. I relocated twice during COVID. I relocated from Toronto to Montreal to a temporary home and then into my full-time home. And I'll be honest with you, the prices didn't move and the inventory was extremely low. And I've seen, as real estate starts to open up, and as we talked about earlier, tourism, we have a lot of foreign buyers in Canada, especially in Montreal. It's had a bit of a slowdown, but the sight unseen buying of condos and mega houses is still continuing to be a trend here. No international, no taxing on vacant properties. But I do think that in a year from now, I think there'll be an immediate spike of people wanting to get out there, and then it'll calm down and be gradual from there, with people being a little bit more cautionary than they were previous to that. On the FDI side, I think it'll continue to increase, and those with a little bit of, as we say, liquidity, especially on the business side, I think they're going to take advantage on the tourism investments in the future over the next year because of how hard hit resorts, and I'm talking more the Canadian side of resorts, very different from the resorts we find in the islands. The ski hills, the summer resorts are going to be hit really hard, and I would tend to say there'd be quite a bit of foreign FDI coming into these markets over the next 12 months.
Thank you. Well, let's certainly hope so. And Dominic, if you were to take out your crystal ball, where do you think we'll be a year from now?
Look, I think from our industry perspective, there's a lot of governments now looking at what can we do, in a response to what's happening on the pandemic, given that, the tourism numbers are down. Where can we fill the gap in terms of funding and bringing people back into the country? So I think more and more governments will look at, more innovative ways of raising sort of capital for these reasons. I think on a personal level, being based in Singapore in my role, I'm used to traveling, to a couple of countries every single week. And I think although I have an amazing airport here in Singapore called Changi, I think the airport, getting through airports, getting through checks, I think general travel at a practical level is going to become a lot slower and a lot more difficult. There's talk of, needing some type of a medical passport now that very clearly shows where you've been, in terms of have you had, if there's a vaccine. So I think it'll be a bit more, there'll be a few more hoops to jump through when you do want to travel. But obviously for me, the sooner we can get back to that, the better.
Yes, I think we can all agree with that. And I think what's obvious is that, the market won't return to normal anytime soon. Life won't necessarily return to normal. Neither will travel, but we'll have to adapt to that. I think what we saw is after 9/11, the ways that we had to adapt to airport security seemed kind of crazy at the time. And now we just take off our shoes and we put our items in bags, and perhaps we'll all adjust to the new travel. And that means that tourism destinations, operators, developers, investors, and promoters will have to adapt as well. That wraps up our panel and also our event. So I want to say a very big thank you to our panelists now. I really enjoyed hearing your insights. There's always so much more that we could talk about, but I hope we've at least given kind of set the scene for some of the challenges, some of the opportunities, and where we can look for growth and opportunity going forward. So thank you very much. I hope our viewers have enjoyed this as much as I have. Thanks very much.